Okay, everybody, this is Introduction to Create Lists. My name is Steve Heiser. I'm the Library Systems Administrator for McFliss. I guess I'm going to have to edit that. So this session will be live streamed and available at our YouTube channel shortly after the session ends. Our YouTube channel is McFliss1, so it's MCFLS1. So if you just do a search for the user for that YouTube channel, you'll find it. We're going to go over the agenda first, but first I wanted to also point out we have a website for Create Lists that has a lot of good information on it, some of which we'll cover today. This address is up here. So this is the website that we're going to be, I wanted you to take a look at. Some of the information here is really useful. The Create List manual we just updated. This is just a PDF, but it has a lot of good screenshots and kind of a walkthrough for different areas of Create Lists. We also have some other areas that we're going to cover today. These County Cat manual inserts. We'll talk about some of these as we go along. And there are some examples at the very bottom of the page. Some of this is related to the advanced list course that we're going to have in November. But it is a pretty good resource, and we try to keep this updated as much as we can. So let's go over the agenda. So we're going to talk about what Create List is, very briefly. We're also going to talk about things to know before you get started. Begin, that's a typo. That's probably the most important part of Create List, because most of the questions I get about Create List is related to things people just haven't thought about before they get started with it. Mostly about what they're trying to get out of the database to begin with. We'll talk about some recent changes to Create Lists and things that have happened in our recent upgrades to Sierra. We'll walk through actually creating a list from start to finish, and with a special focus on Boolean conditions and grouping. We'll also discuss outputting information to Excel, some of the McFliss master lists that we have, and we'll just wrap it up. And if we have some time, we'll do some exercises as well. Okay, so Create Lists is a function within Sierra. It's been there since the beginning, as long as I've been here. Was part of Millennium. Was originally part of the old blue screen Anzio version that we used to use as well. So it's been part of Innovative's products from the very beginning. And it's a very powerful report generator. I've used other ILS systems, and it is in a class by itself in terms of being able to be flexible enough to grab all kinds of information and put it into a list. Essentially what you're doing with Create Lists is creating lists of records. That's all it's doing. But you're setting the criteria by which it's able to grab the correct records that you want. It is probably, for our purposes in terms of McFliss, a management tool, collection management tool. Can be used for circulation, can be used for cataloging. Anything that you come across that deals with records, either bibs, items, patrons, orders, you can grab records, put them in a list, and then maintain your collection that way. The one thing that I also wanted to point out was that this is a static list, and it's based on the coding present at the time that you run the report. So, for example, if you run a missing list and you're looking for an item status of missing, and after the list is run, some of the coding changes within those records, those records are still going to be there. So you're still going to have those records to deal with. What I'm saying is it's not dynamic, and it's not going to remove those records once the coding has changed. It's just a static at the point in time in which that report was run. All right, so the things we need to talk about before you get started, and these are probably the most important things we're going to talk about today. First of all, we have file assignments for all MICFLIS staff for MICFLIS libraries, and that's one of those inserts that we're going to talk off of this website. So this is a CountyCat knowledge base insert. It basically lists all of the file assignments for each library. Every library in the system, every location, I should say, has at least 2 files assigned to it. One is a 5,000 max review file. The other is a 20,000 max review file. That means the number of records you can possibly put in the list will be either 5,000 or 20,000. So you can see the list here. So these are spoken for, essentially. The rule of thumb that we use is essentially everything above 100 as far as the review files go are open for just about everybody with a few exceptions. We also have fairly large review files in file 280 and 360 that are reserved for MICFLIS use, but you can see there's just a few above 100 that are being used on a routine basis. So just keep that in mind. Everything over 100 is pretty much fair game. The biggest thing to remember when using these review files is to just get rid of them when you're finished. A lot of people will keep those review files for a long time. They'll do like a patron registration report and just leave it on there, even though they don't really need that information afterwards. So keeping them around doesn't serve anybody any good. So get rid of them then when you're finished with them. The other thing that I really wanted to focus on today was focusing on the information that you need to get out of the list. And by that I mean, what are you actually trying to get out of it? And you really need to think logically and to isolate sets of data and combine them using these criteria statements that we're going to be using in Create Lists. So I'm going to move forward a few slides and just show you what I'm talking about. I'm an old philosophy guy, so I use a lot of Venn diagrams when it comes to using Create Lists. I think this is the easiest way to talk about it. Let's just use an example here. If I wanted to find all Oak Creek lost and missing items updated since the beginning of 2017, what I generally would do is break apart that statement into sets of data. So I know that I want to focus on Oak Creek items. That's going to be one set of data within the database. Lost and missing items, and also those items updated since the start of the year. And what we want is that where that arrow is pointing to, that sweet spot between all of them. Your Venn diagrams are going to be different based on what you're after, but in this case, we're looking for where that all those sets of data coincide with one another. So you want that sweet spot right in the middle. Let's go back a few here. The other thing to consider when putting together a list is the size of the file that you're going to need. Obviously, if you're looking for a one patron or one record that's very specific, you're going to use a smaller review file than, say, like 100,000 or 10,000 max record review file. Sometimes you don't have a choice because there's so many review files that get filled up so quickly. One of the things we're trying to do moving forward is we're going to be cleaning out these review files more often, once a month actually, and only keeping the files that are 2 months or newer. So anything older than that would be removed on a monthly basis. So hopefully you'll be able to find the size file that you need, but just keep that in mind. If you've got the option to choose a smaller file, please use that. Many people often need to use larger size files. For example, if you're looking for your entire collection, you want to fit that into one review file. It's often very difficult to find the 100,000 file that you need. So just keep that in mind when you're putting it together. The other thing that's important is the record format you're storing. This is probably one of the most commonly misunderstood parts of Create Lists, is that within the actual list window, you can actually determine what stored record type you're going to be using. So if you want to store bibs, you're going to get a list of bib record numbers. If you want to store items, that's what's going to be returned to you within the list. And we'll go into create list real quickly here. Okay, so it's a little hard to see here. Let's see if we can magnify this a little bit. No, I guess it's not going to work. But within the list window, let's just scroll down a little bit here, find a good review file to use. We go to search records to open our pop-up. You'll see the stored record type here is set to bibliographic. That is the default for the system. But what's important to note here is not just that this is the type of record that you're going to be receiving or returning in your file, but it also has an impact on the types of fields that you can search off of. And we call that the law of OneHop. So if I have my stored record type here set to bibliographic, I can go down here to the type column, which is the field or the record type. And if I double click on this, I have options to search off of bibliographic field information, order, check-in, and item information because when we store our record as bibs, we have links to orders, we have links to check-ins, we have links to items. Those are our attached records to bibs. So there's a natural linking going on there. If I change this, for example, to patron, and I double click type, I only have access to patron field information and items. So there's a link here, a linking that needs to take place in order for you to search off of that. What you're saying is if you're storing record type as a patron and you're searching off of item information, it means that the patrons that are returned have a link to the items, the item field information that you're looking for. So if you say item status equals build, all those patrons that you return in your list are going to have build items attached to their record. So that's some of the things you have to think about when you're putting this together. Don't get that quite as much anymore, but that's definitely an error that occurs that people just don't understand why they can't search off of certain fields. And that's why, because it has to have a link to those to begin with. While we're here, we can talk about some of the features of create list. We're in the create list function. To get there, you have to just choose create list from the drop-down menu. My menu is quite substantial, but most others are fairly stripped down, maybe about 10 or 12 functions, depending on what your needs are and what your function is at your library. So you click create list here, and it's just a function. Everybody should have access to create lists. There's no restrictions on it, and there's no permissions to actually start creating a list. You may have permission issues when it comes to viewing or editing records, but as far as viewing records, you shouldn't have any problems creating a list, at least getting started. Off to the left-hand side, you'll see review files is the default view. We also have save searches, save sorts, lists, and exports. These are, searches in particular, are these areas that you can actually save to the server and then retrieve your list of criteria at the point at which you want to create a new list. Say, for example, you have a monthly list that you create every month, has the same data except for maybe a date or two or a code or two that needs to be changed. You can retrieve that save search within this window. We go to search records, and you can click on retrieve save query, and that will pull in the information. Let's just say I've got a there's a monthly no link report that I run every month, and this is to find unlinked bib records. It takes a little time for it to load. But as soon as I click the OK button, all those criteria are brought into my window, and I can just click on search right here if everything is the way I need it to be. In this case, it is. I'm just searching on specific codes and cat dates. So everything there is exactly the way it needs to be, and I just bring it in, hit search, and then my search will execute. So that's how those save searches. You can also do sorting. Exports is a very popular one as well. So if you have columns or fields that you want to export on a routine basis, you can do that. Along the top here of the review file window, you have search records, which starts the process. When you're looking at an existing review file, you can click on sort records, or which will allow you to sort the records in any way you want. We'll talk about that in a little bit. List records is essentially the same as printing records. What you do is you tell Sierra what fields that you want to print off, and it will put it in horizontal rows. We used to use that a lot, but now that export records is here, many people just export the data to Excel, and then they'll be able to manipulate the data that way. Import records is a fairly new function that's been added. This allows you, if you have a list of record numbers that you want to import into Sierra, it will allow, oops, I don't want to do that. It will allow you to set a review file name, you set your stored record type, and then it will allow you to choose a text file and then import that file of record numbers directly into Sierra and create a list based off of that. I don't use this as much, although it does come in handy when, for example, I'm using SQL and I have a list of record numbers that I can generate. I can just pull that right into create list and give that to a staff member to look over. That's sort of more of an advanced piece of this. What would be nice to be able to do is actually have a list of barcodes that you could actually use for that same purpose. Again, if you're working with an existing list, you can also export the records, which we'll talk about at the very end. Show records will allow you to look at whatever records are in the current list that you're viewing. Whenever you're viewing records, the record number is usually the first column, and if you're looking at bibliographic level information, the description is usually the title. If you're looking at patrons, it's usually the patron name. Those are the defaults. And another area that comes in handy is show info. So if I'm looking at an existing list, I can click on show info, and then that information about the criteria or any sorting that has taken place on this list will come up, and it's very useful when it comes to troubleshooting your list. Say you got a list that doesn't make any sense, it's got too many records in it. This is an easy way to just see what your criteria, see the criteria that you've used prior, and make some corrections. And I'll show you an easy way to make those happen as well. Okay, along the top here we have different buttons. Some of these we'll cover, some of those we won't. You can append records to an existing review file. So for example, if I wanted to append more item records to this review file here in 104, I could just click on append. It will open up a pop-up window for a new search, and any records that I find in this new window will just be appended to the existing 34 records that have been there originally. When you do that type of appending, sometimes you'll have duplicate records that will appear within the same file, and to dedupe those records, just to make sure that there's one entry for each record that you want to deal with, you just click on dedupe and it will get rid of any duplicates. And it's really a nice way to also work with existing review files that may have records deleted. It will do kind of like what a sort records function does, and just get rid of all the empty stuff and just leave you with the active records that are still in the database. You can also copy a review file. So if you wanted to copy this to another existing review file or empty review file, you can do that. You would just click here and then copy, and then you can choose whatever file that you want from this list. So in addition to the 360 areas that we have open for review files, there are system-generated review files that are also available. Don't use these as much, but like overdue items is one that we copy from the system-generated list and put it into an actual review file. That's usually in file 161. And we have a few other areas that are generated overnight. Purchase alerts is another one that we pull out from the system-generated list and put into a review file. I think it's either 121 or 120. Yeah, so if you actually go down here, you'll see those purchase alerts that we use. And if you go down to 161, you'll see the overdue items. So those are system-generated lists that we just pull, we just copy directly from that area and put into the actual review file so that staff can view them. The last thing I wanted to mention about this is that there's a nice filter button at the very top of the screen, this drop-down. What it'll do is filter based on the status of the report. So if you wanted to find all empty review files, you could do that quickly by just clicking on the empty filter. And you can see we have quite a few here because we've just cleaned them all out. You can also use for the for those that are in progress. Currently, don't have anything going on right now, but that's pretty much the only reason I would use those, either to find an empty list or those that are in progress if I have something going on. We do have 360 review files, so it's a lengthy list to look at. Okay, so that's just an overview of the interface itself. If we go back to this real quick, I wanted to talk about some of the new fields that we've added. There are new fields for holds and finds that are available for circulation purposes. Those fields are available both in the item records, record fields, and also the patron record fields. There are new operators for exist and not exist. These are for fixed fields only and mostly for dates. So if you're looking for due date not exist, you could do that, or some other field related to that. That's not used quite as often, but it's there if you wanted to use it. There are new searching methods. We'll go back to our list here. We open up a. You'll notice that in the new version of Sierra, things have been modified a little bit. The biggest difference is that instead of just the classic, that's the original review file interface, we also have enhanced, which is essentially the same thing as the classic, except it's got what should be what's considered to be a more easier to use interface, and the JSON, which is a much more difficult or complex version of the same types of information. So for example, if we bring in, we'll just use an existing search here. We bring that in, I can look at it in the classic version. If I go to enhanced, it's pulling in the same search this way. The biggest advantage to using enhanced is that you can search on the same variable field more than once. I'm talking about specifically things like note fields, where you may have more than one note field and in a record, and you want to search on that specific note field twice. You want to look for phrases or searches within the same field more than once. That's something you can't do in the classic version, but you can do in the enhanced version. And if we look at the JSON version of this same search, doesn't seem very useful, but what it can be useful for is if you're working with somebody outside of our system and you want to send them your search parameters, you can cut and paste this entire window, put that into a text file or an email, and they can cut and paste directly into their own version of Sierra, and it should work, figuratively. They have standardized this enough so that it doesn't matter what your field labels are, it should pull in the same information regardless of what system parameters or settings that they have. As long as they're using Sierra, they should be able to pull it into the same search. But we cover this in more detail in the advanced course in November, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but I just want to let you know it's there. Okay, the other thing that I find really interesting just to point out, and it's only available in catalog mode or in search holds mode, is this tool called Browse Query. So it's underneath Tools and Browse Query, and it uses the same parameters as Create Lists, but it doesn't save the information permanently. So it's useful for one-offs. So if I wanted to find, the common example I use is like a patron phone number. So if I wanted to find a patron with a telephone that has a certain string, I can do that, and I don't have to tie up a list. I'll just use this one to do this. So if I just want to do a phone number search, say for example there's a problem with teleforms, telephone notification, if I click on search, it will return all the records that have that phone number attached to it. And if I have permissions, I can edit, view, do whatever I want to this particular record, and then save it back to the database. The only difference between this and Create Lists is that as soon as I click close or move to a different function, all of my records that are displaying here currently as my results are going to disappear. So if I click close, there's no way to get back to it. They just disappear. But it's good for a one-off, and you don't have to tie up a list, or if there's not a list available, you can do a quick search that way. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the process of creating a list step by step. So we'll go back to our Create List function, choose an empty review file somewhere in the hundreds. So the first thing we're going to do is select an empty review file. It's the first step. And then we're going to click on Search Records. And the first step is to name your review file. And we actually have steps that you would use to make this happen. And it's actually that same insert that we looked at before for file assignments. The very bottom of this, there's a little short bulleted point area that talks about how to name the review files. And this is mostly for identifying the library and the date. Those are the most important parts of this. So you want to put in the library code. If you're at Milwaukee Public, you would put in MPL or Central, whatever location you're at. Put a brief description of the file, something very simple. It could be a few words. Your initials, and also the date. The date's important because of the fact that we're clearing these out on a regular basis, and I need to know which date the file was actually created. So in this case, we're going to be, in our example here, we're going to be using Oak Creek missing and lost and paid items since the beginning of the year. So in our case, we'll use Oak C as the identifier for the library. I'll say missing and lost paid, my initials, and then today's date. Okay, so that's good enough for that. We talked about that stored record type before, so that's important here because we need to figure out what record data we're looking for. In this case, it's obviously going to be items because we're looking for missing and lost and paid items. The next area that you need to think about is the what subset of the database you're looking at. The default here is range, and that would look at the entire database. You'll notice that there are start and stop numbers. These are the first record. This indicates the first record in the system at the start position, and the stop is the latest, generally the latest record added to the database, and that number that's assigned to it. What's nice here is that you can actually change these numbers based on information that you may have, and we actually have another insert that's assigned to this purpose, and that's D36, ranges of various record types by year. For each record type, most of them, we have ranges for years. So if you wanted to just look at those items added since the beginning of the year, you could simply just pull in this number and put it into that start position, and your range of records would be limited to those item records. You can do the same for bibliographic level information, patrons, and we also have orders divided up by each accounting unit. So it's not as critical these days to have this type of information, but it's useful. I know that some folks use this on a regular basis. It was more critical back in the day when it used to take 5 hours or longer for a report to run, and you wanted to really limit the type of information you were searching on. So we'll keep that there for now. We'll just keep the default. The other option here that we're going to talk about is review. So you can search off the range, which is the full database, or a review file. And what this allows you to do is to apply your criteria to an existing review file that already is on the system. So you could choose any list here. A popular master list that is often used for this purpose is file 280. Oops. There it is. And so what you would be doing in this case is applying your criteria that you have here lower just to file 280 and the 77,000 or so records in that review file. So you're not searching on the entire database, just the records within that review file. Commonly what's done here is, if this is an item list, so many libraries will just find their own items using their criteria here. So item, for example, item loc has 12. So that would be a common search that if you were at South Milwaukee, you would use to find your no-circ 5-year items. And that's all you would have to do because all the criteria has already been set up within the master list in file 280, and you're just pulling the South Milwaukee items from that list. Okay. In our case, we have a couple other options here for index and advanced, which I don't frankly use all that often. We'll cover that in the advanced course though. These are the two that are most commonly used, so we'll keep that at range. Okay. So this is at the point in which we're going to actually start creating criteria, and we'll talk about each one of these pieces here. So in order to work with these criteria statements, there's a few ways you can get to the information within each column. First off, you can double click, you make your cursor active within the type column. This would be the record type. and you can double click and find that information. Just click on item, bibliographic, or patron. The other way you can do it is to make your cursor active and just type in the letter. If you'll notice, if we double click here, there's a little letter or number or symbol that's in the upper left hand of each of one of these areas. I is for item, B for bibliographic, P for patron. So if I just want to do a shortcut, I just hit I for item. And what I tend to do is just hit the tab key to get over to the next column. If I know the field number, I can put it in here. However, I can just do the double click as well and find, if I'm not familiar enough with these fields, I can just select them using my mouse. I can also, if I'm familiar with this, start typing the number, and you'll see that a list of all the fields appears in a list, and I can use my up and down arrows to go up and down this list and select the correct field. Then just tab over and you can put in the next piece of information. So we've in our case here, we're going to be identifying the library first. So if you remember our Venn diagram, let's go back to that. We need to isolate Oak Creek items from the set. We need to narrow it down to Oak Creek. We need to narrow it down to lost or missing items, and also narrow it down to items updated since the start of the year. So our first step is to isolate that set of data for Oak Creek. The easiest way to do that for a library is to use the item location field. Since all of our loan rules and circ is dependent on that item loc field being accurate, it's probably the most tried and true way to identify a library's items. So in this case, we're going to use the item loc field, and we would need to use the condition here to actually identify what library we're looking at, in our case Oak Creek. But I want to talk a little bit about some of these conditions because there's a lot you can do with them. So the most obvious ones that we can work with first are equal to and not equal to. Those are pretty self-explanatory. You're going to be looking, for example, for an item log that matches exactly a specific code, like 12 ADV or 1 AF, whatever code that you're looking for. If you want an exact match, you can do that. You can also look for not equal to and not match that code. So those are pretty obvious. What people don't realize is that you can also search for the absence of a field by using the by keeping that value column blank. So if we wanted to say find errors, let's just say we wanted to find every item where the item loc was equal to blank. That's generally an error in our system. Every record in the system should at least have an item location assigned to it. So if you wanted to find errors, you could just leave that value A column blank and find anything where there was an absence of a field. You could also use that for item types. Anything that should have a field or a value assigned to it but doesn't, you can use this to find the absence of a field. The other thing that's really useful for me is using the not equal to condition with the blank value A. So if I wanted to change this to not equal to, if I leave that blank, what's going to happen is Sierra is going to return all records where the item location is not equal to nothing. And if you know your logic, that means it's going to find something. So two negatives mean a positive in this case. This is useful for the example that I use often is patron email addresses, but you can kind of find other examples. If I wanted to find a list of patrons that had email addresses, but I didn't care what that email address was. I just wanted to make sure that there was a value in that field. I could use patron email address not equal to nothing, and it would return me all the patrons with at least something in that email address field. So you can kind of consider that in your own line of work and where you might be able to use that. We also have other conditions for greater than, less than or equal to. All of those are great for numbers. So if you're looking at, for example, total checkouts, current checkouts, number of renewals, a lot of circ functions are related to this, or you wanted to find monetary numbers. So for example, a patron has money owed greater than $5. You could do that using these criteria. What you don't want to do is use them with dates if you can at all avoid it. The reason being is that some dates may have blank values. So if you say, for example, search for due date less than March 31st of 2017, it's going to find everything with a due date, an actual due date less or earlier than March 31st of 2017, but also everything that has a blank value as well. So that's something that you got to consider when you're using greater than and less than with dates. We'll come back to this other one. Another condition that's very useful is all fields don't have, and at least one field doesn't have. This is really good when you're using this with multiple instances of variable length fields in a record, like a note field or any kind of repeatable variable length field, where you want to find all fields, all the note fields don't have a particular value or have a particular value. And at least one field doesn't have is good, because you may have multiple note fields where it doesn't matter what one note field has, but you want to find at least one instance where it matches a string of characters that you're looking for. So it's useful to have that. I've used that in the past. We also have range operators. Between would be finding a range of dates, for example, between September 1st and September 30th. Or in our case, we're going to use it for the beginning of the year, perhaps. There are also the starts with and ends with operators. These are fairly new. These have been around a little bit, but this will find values that exist at the start of the field or at the end of the field. Those are commonly used in regular expressions, but I know some libraries use this when identifying their library items. Like, for example, item location starts with 16 would find all the Greendale items within the system. We're going to do it a little bit of a different way. I also wanted to, I'm just going to change this briefly, show you some conditions related to dates. So this is a relatively new addition to create lists. These are relative date fields, so you can say, I want the item due date, in our case, equal to today, equal to yesterday, within the last week or within the last month. So we'll return, for example, you give it this condition here, and it will find all item due dates within the last week. So that's good if you wanted to save this search and then run it again. You could just do it. It'd be all relative to the point at which the list is actually run. The only thing you want to be careful with are these three here. Is this many days ago? Is this many weeks ago? Is this many months ago? It's not going to be a range of dates. It's going to find an exact date. Let's say, is this many days ago? If I put in item due date, is this many days ago, and I put 7, it's not going to find a range of dates for due dates from today back to the 5th. It's going to find every item with a due date on October 5th and nothing else. So it's not going to find a range. It's going to be a specific day. And that goes the same for, is this many weeks ago, is this many months ago? So it's going to have be that specific month, that specific week. So that's all I really wanted to talk about with regard to conditions. There's one other one that I think is probably the most popular we're going to use in this case. First of all, we're going to put in our item location. And then we're going to put in has, which is probably the most used condition in our system, at least that's my thought about that. Has definitely means contains. So you're looking for whatever string or of characters you put in your value A column, the item loc field has to have that set of characters in order for it to be retrieved in your results. So item loc has 24 means that it's going to find all of the Oak Creek items because all Oak Creek items have 24, that string within the item location field. Many people try to use equals when they first start out using create lists. They don't understand that equals is an exact match. You can't use equals in this case because it will not find everything in the library. It's just going to find all those item locations exactly matching 24. There may be a few stragglers within their collection that match 24, but you're not going to get anything near, you know, the entire set of their items. So if we correct that, that should be the criteria statement used to identify their items. Okay, and in our case, we've got our Venn diagram again. We've got the Oak Creek items taken care of. We're going to then look at items updated since the start of 2017. So there's a couple ways you could do this. To add a line to a set of criteria, you could use insert, which would insert the line above your current criteria line, or append it, which would have put it below. And I can also delete that criteria line if I wanted to. In this case, I'm just going to append it directly below. It puts the AND operator automatically underneath. So it's automatically going to try to AND things unless you change that to something like OR. You only have a couple of options here. So in our case, we're going to limit the updated field for these items to something from the start of the year to the current. So I'm going to go against my own rules and use, I know that 84 is the updated field for the record, so when the record was last updated. And that goes for every record, like patrons, items, and bibs, orders, all use the same number for created and updated. They're all the same. 83 is created, 84 is updated. And I'm going to use the greater than or equal to statement here, because I can use this because every record in the system has to have an updated date. There's just some of these things you just gather as you get more experience with these records. But each record in the system has to have an updated date, even if it's never been touched since the day it was created. It will always have some kind of date in that field. So I'm going to say item updated greater than 1/1/2017. Then I'm going to append a few more lines below this and put in the missing statuses. We need missing and lost and paid statuses added to this to make it correct. So right now we were limited to Oak Creek in items at Oak Creek updated greater than January 1st, 2017. We're going to add that last set of criteria to limit it just to those items with a status of lost and paid and missing. So I know the status field is 88. I can use the equals condition here because we're looking for a specific field, status. If you use equal to, especially for fixed field information or only for fixed field information, you can actually select the values from a list here. This would be all the values that we have in the status field. It doesn't work for has or any of these other variable conditions where there could be different strings attached to it. It's only for equal to or not equal to. And since we're looking for both missing or lost and paid, we have to change the operator here to O. Change it to item, do another status, equal to $, which is lost and paid. Now, if I just ran this right now, these are all the statements that we need to make this work. However, if I just ran this now, we would have a problem. We would not get the records we would want. What it would do, it would find all the items at Oak Creek, those that have been updated since the beginning of the year and have a missing status. But it would also retrieve, because we have that OR statement at the end, it would also find everything in the system that has a status equal to lost and paid regardless of ownership location. So it's going to find your review file is going to fill up almost immediately. In order to deal with that, what you have to do is nest both the missing and lost and paid statuses together. The way that you do that is you select the first one, hold down your shift key, and then press the second line. So in this case, 3 and 4. You'll notice at that point a group button lights up here on the side. You can click on group, and what it will do is process this correctly. So it will process this first. It will find all items in the system that have missing or lost and paid status, and then add those to these other statements in lines 1 and 2. So that will narrow our list appropriately, and we'll take a look at that when we look at the results. So our list is pretty much done here. I'm going to go ahead and click on search, and we'll talk about these other buttons as after this runs here. Okay, so this should be our list here. It's running. While it's running, I can point out I've also run this list prior to today in file 136. So we'll use that as our result file because it's going to take a little bit of time for that file to run. So say for example, I've run this list. I can look at show info to see what I've used in the past to make this list run. You'll see I've also sorted this by item due date. Any sorts that you apply to the review file previously will also be listed here. You can show records. So if I go to show records, it will show me all the information here related to these records that we've collected. If I double click on one of these and just double check to make sure that the record is what I need, you'll see that there are, our item locus is correct. These are Oak Creek materials. It should be either lost and paid or missing. That's correct. And their updated date was after January 1st of this year. So this might be a good list that you could use for reordering materials. If you wanted to collect that, you may want to choose a date range that's a little bit later, maybe something that's been out. You may want to give patrons time to return those materials. If they're missing, you may want to give it a little bit more time for those items to be retrieved. But this would be a good list to start with. But let's just say, for example, you had a problem with an existing file and you wanted to run it again. If we go to search records, you're going to get a warning that you're going to overwrite the contents. You say yes. And it's going to pop in the review file name that we used previously. The stored record type is not going to be set. Everything's going to be kind of new right from the get-go. But for example, you want to fix something that was in the file. Say you didn't want to search on missing items, but only in lost and paid, but you want to look at missing and in transfer, or something like that, in transit items. You could use the existing search button here. And what this is really useful for is if you screw up, you can easily pull your criteria back into a list. So for example, we have our file 136 here. We can click use, and it will automatically pull all the criteria statements that you had used previously into your window that you can then edit. So if we wanted to change this from lost and paid to in transit, we could do that and then run our list again, and you don't have to go through all those steps. All your stored record type is information's brought in, your range. If you chose to search off a review file, all that information's brought back into the window and you can just run your search again. This is also a good opportunity to show you that you can retrieve a saved query. You can only do this when you're in this window. What I find useful to do is if I know that I've got a query that I've named, and this is why we ask folks to put their library name at the very beginning of these query names. I can search or sort on this query name column and just scroll down and find the list that I'm looking for. If I go back to that monthly no link, for example. Click on select, and it just overwrites everything that was in there to begin with. So that's a real easy way to start a search over without having to recreate the wheel. And let's just say if we wanted to, we can retrieve a saved query, existing one, or we can actually save our criteria statement to a new query, saved query, by using save or save as. Either one of these two will do the same function. So if we wanted to save as, we could rename this as something else and then save it to the list of review files. Now we only have a limited number of saved query spots. I think it's around 500. And right now we're at about 400, so we're okay. But just consider that when you're saving this. If you can reuse some of these, that would be great. I'm just going to close this out here. Okay. As a search is running, yeah, this one is complete already. But as a search is running, you have the option to cancel it using the cancel button here in the upper right-hand corner. We used to be able to pause searches and stop searches, but right now we only have the ability to cancel a search. And it used to wipe out everything once you hit cancel, like any records it had captured at the time. You hit cancel, it would wipe them out. But I've had instances where I've been able to retrieve whatever records were in the search once I canceled it. So it seems like that they're improving that process a little bit. But this would be the only way you would stop a search midway through would be to hit cancel, you know, if you know you screwed up and you want to start over. Okay, and one of the last things I wanted to really talk about was the export function. This is useful for folks that are familiar with Excel and want to export the data they've collected within Create Lists and put it in Excel for further data manipulation. So let's just use our file 106 that we just created here. To export the records, you just need to click on Export. And let's see. What happens here is that you have the ability to select specific fields that you want to export to Excel. For example, in our case, we may want to look at the bib title. All the fields, record types that I had access to before are available. And then the second column might be bib, author, item, call number, or item barcode. So these fields appear horizontally in this display, but what they end up being are columns vertically in Excel. So these are your columns and the data that's going to be attached to that. Everything else below here you can leave as is. The field delimiter is set to comma by default, and that's probably a good thing for most folks. The text qualifier means that it's a double quote, and that means it's going to surround all your field data in double quotes to make sure that there's no confusion with commas if your data has commas within it. Everything else you can leave as is, and what you can do here is click on the Browse button. I've already got one from yesterday that we did before, so I'm going to do version 2. And the trick here is to name your file but using a .csv extension. You can do that. You can leave it at txt, which is fine as a text file, but it will save you a lot of time, especially with review file information from Sierra. It's really easy. If you do use .csv, it will save you a lot of time. So if you click on Save, it will create the file based on the information you've just put in here. You can apply a saved export. If you've saved one previously, you have a number of different rows that you from saved export you want to use. You can save this also if you want to. In our case, we're just going to click OK. And it's going to export the records, create that file for us. And since we have a very small file, it's going to take just a few minutes. But in many cases, you'll have a larger number of records, and it's just going to take a longer time for the export process to take place. So if I go back to my computer, find out where that file was located. I think it's underneath Downloads. Or Documents. Yeah, here it is. Because it's a .csv file, Excel knows what to do with that file right off the top. CSV stands for comma separated values. And if I double click on this file, you'll notice that there's an Excel icon next to it. It really knows what to do with that right off the top. So you just double click on it. It will open up Excel, and then all of your columns, all your data will be populated here. So if I click and drag this column over, that's my title. Here's my author, my call number column, and then barcodes. You'll notice some of these barcodes look really weird, but if you just go to the column, select the entire column, select the number format, you have to do this with a few fields, and just select, decrease the decimal. You'll get to the number that you want for your barcode. So that's a really quick and easy way to get it into Excel. And once it's here, you can start sorting columns the way you want to, start using formulas against the data if you need to. So for example, if you have a patrons with a lot of money owed. You can sort them by that column, or items that have a lot of circ. There's all kinds of stuff you can do in Excel that you just can't do within crate lists. Okay, so that's really a quick and easy way to use the export function. Minimize this here. The last thing I wanted to talk about briefly was the MICFLIS master list. And that again is in our crate list resources. This is insert C81. This is just a list of all of the reports that MICFLIS runs, either on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, or yearly basis. Kate Stratner, the help desk assistant for MICFLIS, creates most of these on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis. And you'll see the list of those there. There are links within each of this column here that gives you more explanation about what these lists actually do. We covered one of them before, and that's the last one on the list here, circulating item types never circed in 5 years. That's a popular report that libraries use for weeding purposes. We run a stale holes report for circulation. That is done every Friday by myself. But Kate runs a lot of real important ones. The CAFLAG J report is run for all the suburban libraries every Friday. And there are a number of other reports here. Just so you know that there are master lists, and we tend to send emails out notifying staff that these review files exist and that you can use them to grab your own items and create your sublist. Okay, well, that just about does it for the session here. I'll see if is there anything else we need to cover. I think that's about it. So I'm going to go ahead and end the stream now, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at MICFLIS, and I will hopefully talk to you all soon. Thank you very much.